Hey there, everybody. This is Adam Eason here for another episode of Piecemeal. Today, we're going to go to 1890s France, and we're going to take a look at a phrase from a song by Gabriel Fauré. The song is called À Clymène. This is a text by Paul Verlaine, which is written as an ode to the Greek Titan goddess Clytemnestra. As far as musical things to keep an eye out for and an ear out for, um, by the end of the 19th century, a lot of changes had happened in what kind of harmonies and melodic figurations were considered acceptable for compositional use. In particular, we're going to be looking out for non-functional harmony as opposed to functional harmony. And we're going to look at Fauré's use of modes other than the minor and major scale. So let's go on over to the melody and see how he put some of these tools to use. All right, here's the melody of the opening 9 bars. It starts on this D, slowly winds its way down to this G, adds a little ornament on that G, and then rises back up to this A. If you're an aspiring composer and you're analyzing the work of other composers, it's often a good idea to look at how they shape the arc of their melodic line, and especially looking at where they start and what their target is, because great composers often have a particular goal in mind for their melodies. In this case, Fauré starts on this D and is aiming for this A. So this G here is Fauré overshooting by just a little bit to add a little bit more extra melodic curve right at the end. Also kind of interesting are these little wrinkles in here. These eighth notes we would call escape tones. So they're starting on a chord tone, they step up and skip out, step up and skip out. We'll see if these are actually non-chord tones or if these tones are part of the chord in the harmony written underneath this later, but that kind of figuration is a little bit uncommon. Also uncommon, we have the key signature of a B flat and starting on D, which seems to indicate to us D minor. But right in the first bar, he doesn't give us a B flat. He just cancels this out with a natural. And even in the next bar, still B natural. Even in the voice later on, B natural. He doesn't give us any B flats in this opening melody at all. And in fact, if I play this melody without any harmonic or bass support, you might even hear that this A is what our ear hears as tonic. So I'm going to play these first 4 measures and listen and see if that A sounds more like a final resting place than our D that we start on. If we're in A minor, this would be a little bit strange. In most classical European music, this would be a G sharp leading up to the A, but it does sound like that A is our final stopping point, that A might actually be tonic. But with the key signature here, Fauré is insisting, no, D is the tonic, because he's setting up the expectation of D minor. With the B natural, though, the scale that he gives us is the D Dorian scale. At this point in time, there had been a resurgence in interest of medieval music and ancient Greek music, even the title, À Clymène, right? An ode to an ancient Greek goddess. As part of that came a renewed interest in what are called the modes, the modal scales. And D Dorian is one of those modal scales. So that you can hear what this would sound like if this were instead written with B flats and it followed the key signature that Fauré gave you, let's take a moment and hear the playback for this line with the key signature as given. when it's written in this way, that A feels a little bit less final than it did before, and it has a very different flavor even without any harmonic context. At this point, the voice enters with a pickup to this A here in measure 5. Da, 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 da. And the voice winds its way up to this C natural. There's a pretty interesting skip here down a fifth and right back up a fifth. That's not super vocal. It's not idiomatic to the voice, but I kind of wonder if this figuration of using a fifth as a melodic interval is also a callback to medieval music writing, maybe ancient Greek music theory that was starting to circulate back into academic music writing. Again, thinking about the arc of the melody and the direction of the melody, at the beginning we had started descending from D to A. The voice starts lower, but ultimately its first note, its first strong note, is this A here, and the voice winds generally in an upward direction towards this C natural. Right at the end of the phrase, the piano does a little bit of an echo. You can see this F to C in the voice is echoed by F to C in the piano. And right at the end, Fauré has this curious mix of new and old. He's using modes, which were at that time so old it was new, and he's mixing it with functional tonal harmony, this C sharp part of ultimately an A7 chord leading back to D minor. A quick note about this moment here, this echo. If you have a couple of really good performers who are really attentive and have really tight ensemble, there's a cool psychoacoustic effect that happens where the piano picks up that C where the vocalist leaves off, and it creates this kind of musical sleight of hand where the ear hears this piano tone emerging out of the vocal tone, and there's a moment of confusion where the ear doesn't know exactly what it's listening to, and it tries to fill in the gaps by kind of averaging it out. And so this piano sounds almost like it's a vocal sound coming out of the piano. It's a pretty cool moment, and I just wanted to point that out because I thought it was neat. Okay, here we are filling in the bass line. Fauré is still very much in this tradition of writing bass-oriented harmony that is supporting the melodic line. He starts us on this low D, which is, again, from the key signature as expected. He moves up to an A, which, if you're in functional harmony world, that A would be, as the fifth scale degree, an A major chord of some kind. It's a little bit weird, though, that if you look up here, there's no third. We'll see if Fauré decides to fill in that third with the harmony. I guess technically there is a third right here with a C, but it passes by really fast and it's on a weak beat, and we don't really hear it as the third of the chord. Fauré brings us back down to a D. Looking at just these first three notes, this would be a 1-5-1, tonic, dominant, tonic. And that figuration would have been just stock bread and butter of European harmony for the past 200, 300 years at this point. But again, what's a little bit strange, this interval here, if you condense it, is an interval of a fourth. So that doesn't quite strike me as being a one chord, right? We're missing the F, so this would be some kind of inversion. So already Fauré is kind of subverting our expectations of what this low D would have meant to music theory ears at his time. In the fourth measure, to round out the 4-bar phrase, he ends on a C sharp with an A that together would create the sense of a half cadence. The C sharp in the bass is maybe a little bit unusual. A half cadence would more traditionally at this time have started with the A in the bass and then maybe the C sharp or the seventh in the voice. That's not what he gives us. He gives us an inversion here. I want to spend a little bit of time just listening to how this bass interacts with the melody because it doesn't quite fit what you would expect it to do. And then I'm going to tinker around with the bass line and show what maybe a more academic approach to writing a bass supporting this melody might have been. Okay, there's some oddities, especially right here with this A and missing the third. Maybe the third's in the harmony, we'll see. This one definitely stood out as being a little, okay. I'm going to change the melody back to the D minor version that I played earlier. And I'm going to change this to a 1-5-1 kind of phrase. Excuse me. I'm going to change this to a 1-4-5-1 phrase. This would have been utterly banal by this time, just totally cliche for this time. But let's hear what it sounds like. Quite different, right? So clearly Fauré has something else in mind for this bass line and this melody, and we'll hear that when the rest of the harmony gets filled in. Picking up where we left off, the bass at this point starts to harmonize with the voice. It starts harmonizing at the sixth. It moves on, harmonizing at the third or the 10th. Right here, we get a tritone. Tritones in European classical music are highly dissonant moments that would require special treatment for their resolution. And in fact, that is what he gives us. He gives us a fairly traditional resolution to this tritone. The B resolves up to the C, and the F resolves down to the E. Hopefully that train's not too distracting. Here's another interesting moment. I actually separated in two voices what happens here because the descending line from the E here to the D seems to indicate that when this comes in, he's thinking in two different voices, and this is the actual bass line. I'll pick that apart in just a second. Again, we get harmonizing in the sixths, harmonizing at the third, the octave, and then a more traditional 5-1 cadence right at the end. The bass line that starts at this G and descends down to this D here is just moving step by step. It's going down the scale. And because the piano only has one timbre, or if you have an exceptional pianist, maybe some slightly different colors, this G still sounds like it's the bass of the texture. But then right here, he adds an extra voice sneaking in from underneath and reveals this particular voice to have been, maybe you could consider it the tenor of the harmonic texture line. I think, again, this is another one of those moments where there's a subversion of expectations, where you think you know where something is, and then, no, Fauré has other ideas for what's going on. With all of that in mind, let's play the bass line supporting this entire melody across the opening phrase. Okay, I've filled in the harmony. This isn't how it would be in the score. I've condensed a lot of the texture into stacked chords so that we can analyze them a little bit more easily and see how they all stack up. To start with, we have a D minor chord, nothing crazy. D, A, F natural, D minor fits with the key signature, nothing crazy. Remember how I asked, is Fauré going to fill in that third with the harmony? Nah, he doesn't. A, E, B natural, and just this fleeting hint of a C. There's nothing there to suggest what kind of chord quality this might have. And even that C, which would maybe suggest to us that it's an A minor chord, which is still kind of a little odd for traditional European harmony, even that C doesn't really suggest to us very much because it lands on a weak beat and it passes by so quickly. Then we had this suggestion of an inversion, and again, that's exactly what he gives us. He gives us, though, an inversion of a G7. G, F, B natural. When we look then from that G7 to, here's the A major, kind of dominant chord quality, that would give us a 4-5 progression. But because this is such a strange inversion and he resolves it in such a strange way, it kind of has an unusual feeling to it, even though in theory this is just 4-5. Moving on, this G is actually an inversion of that A7 chord, leading us ultimately to, I realized I didn't fill in all of it. There should be a D on top of that. We get a D minor at the beginning of the vocal melody. That descending bass line, descending tenor line is what we decided it was. First, we get a G7 with a 7 in the bass. That resolves pretty naturally to a C major chord in first inversion. Right here, another weird moment. We've got G, D, F. That seems to suggest to us another G7 chord. But if you look when Fauré fills in the rest of the harmony, he gives us a C. The B isn't present at all. That kind of stacking, he has this in mind as maybe a dissonance, but it's not the kind of dissonance that most composers of Europe through the early 19th century or through the 18th century would have thought of using. That C ends up being something of an anticipation of the C major chord, which is in an inversion. We've got a 6-4 inversion. And again, 6-4 chords in academic voice leading harmony have a certain way of resolving, and that's not what he gives us. Instead, he just repeats that strange, qualityless chord built on G, which then comes out to another C major chord. And even here, moving from C major to A major to D minor, I think for the late 19th century, that wouldn't have been extremely out of the ordinary. But again, we've come a long ways from the world of Mozart and Beethoven, where that kind of chord progression wouldn't really have been in the cards for them so much. Okay, so I'm going to play how this harmony sounds when it's supporting the melody. Very nice. But I do want to step back and try out that D minor version just so you can hear what the tonal melody and harmony might have sounded like if he were being held with his feet to the fire to stay really strictly in line with tonal harmony. All right, I'll just do the first 4 measures. I think you'll get the sense of the idea. Very different, very different, and clearly not at all what Fauré had in mind for his vision in this song. Finally, I'm going to take a look at the texture. There's not as much to say about this, but there are a couple of notes that I think are worth looking at. The way he unfolds these chords is as an arpeggio. Nothing super strange about that. That's common. I mean, think of a Chopin nocturne, arpeggios all over the place. That rest, however, throws a weird monkey wrench into the texture. When you have an arpeggiation like this, it builds a kind of momentum. And if you think of it in maybe a Newtonian kind of way, objects in motion tend to stay in motion, you would expect that that momentum would continue on. When he throws that rest in there, then it creates a weird kind of jerk to it. And he keeps that up through the entire opening sequence. Even when the voice comes in at the end of measure 4, that third beat is still more of a pause rather than something that's rolled through with an arpeggiation. There's a little bit extra momentum with some more notes on the very last 8th note of each bar, but it really isn't the same. So that you can maybe have a sense of what it would feel like if these rests were filled in as you might expect them to be filled in, let me go ahead and add some notes to this texture so that you can hear that. Okay, here's the fixed version. And here's what Fauré gives us. Kind of an odd herky-jerky feeling created by this texture. When you look ahead at the rest of the phrase, it's basically a repetition of this same idea, although again with a little bit more of a nudge at the end of each bar. All right, so we've talked a lot about different kind of unusual things about this phrase, some unexpected resolutions, some unexpected chords, weird bass lines. Let's go ahead and hear how this whole phrase sounds when put together. At this point, it pretty much repeats itself and continues on. There's only one little chord change right at the very end where he takes us to a new harmonic landscape for a new verse of the text. All right, that was the first 8 to 9 measures of Gabriel Fauré's À Clymène, written in 1891. I do want to spend a little bit of time with the text because I think the text helps illuminate why Fauré was making all of these kind of unusual, somewhat dodgy choices. The text that Fauré set at this point is really only 2 words, mystique barcarolle, mystic barcarolles. A barcarolle is basically a Venetian gondolier song. And that fits in line with where Fauré was in 1891. At this year, he was actually visiting Venice. And the first two songs of this song cycle were written while he was in Venice on his vacation. Mystic barcarolle seems to indicate some kind of song that is out of the ordinary, something kind of exotic, something that you can't quite understand. And when this phrase repeats, he's setting the next line of the text, romance sans parole, songs without words. Songs without words are something of a 19th century trope. There are some piano pieces by Mendelssohn, the famous Lied en Vert, which are songs without words. But for the French at this time, the romance sans parole seems to have some kind of, again, exotic quality to them, that you're singing something that can't quite be expressed. It can only be expressed through music. And seeing as Paul Verlaine was a symbolist poet, this is pretty well in line with these ideas of using language in these surreal, quasi-surreal ways to get at something which can't quite be expressed in language. Altogether, then, this song is using somewhat familiar tonal harmonic tropes and somewhat familiar tonal language tropes in very unfamiliar ways. And that, to me, seems to support this text of Mystique barcarolle, romance sans parole, right? These musics, these songs that exist somewhere beyond language, somewhere beyond the ordinary and mundane. All right, that is it for today. Hopefully you got something out of this video and enjoyed it, learned something, and might be interested in exploring more of Fauré's songs. I personally think that Fauré is a fantastic composer. He tends to get maybe short shrift a little bit when people talk about him, but I don't know, that seems unfair. All of his music is quite fantastic. Okay, with that, if you enjoyed this video, learned something, go ahead and click the like button. I'll have more coming in future weeks. I have a lot of ideas for other phrases I'd like to analyze. So you can also hit the subscribe, hit that bell button if you'd like to keep up with those. All right, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.